So I figured since the vibe of this subreddit seems to be okay, I might try to gradually post some of the fairly intense encounters I've had so far in my life. I'm about 30, and most of these have occurred between ages 10 to 20. Apologies in advance, they may often be long-winded. When I was 10 years old, my family moved from Toronto to a small town of about 1,000 people in rural New Brunswick, Canada. It is a historic area, mostly old-timers, with a strong religious culture to the point that this town of 1,000 people has 6 large churches and several smaller ones. The house we moved into was a small duplex with us occupying both top and bottom, and there were no other houses for about a kilometer. The only other property and place nearby was the historical graveyards, with graves dating at the earliest in the 1800s, and this was about 20 feet from the house, as the place had been the old gravekeepers. On the day of my 11th birthday, I had invited a friend to sleep over. While my sisters were sleeping upstairs, I had the only room in the basement to myself, which had been converted from a wine cellar. Enough setup. On the night of the sleepover, everything had been normal so far, aside from the usual weird feelings. Taps turning on themselves, which I don't think was spooky yet, and the lights flickering, which we also think was just normal for the area. My parents were out drinking, and when my sisters went to bed around 10 p.m., my friend and I went to bed shortly after, turning off all the lights, popping on the oil heater, dead of winter at the time, and set up the sleeping bags on the floor of my room. Around 12 midnight, known because of the chime clock, I had woke in bed feeling uneasy and frigid cold. I sat awake for about 20 or so minutes. It felt like it, until I started hearing strange noises. They sounded like an old man moaning in pain, and a chain or something metal dragging on the floor on the other side of my door. I tried to ignore it, but soon after, my friends started shaking me, thinking I was asleep, panicking because they also heard the noises. The noises continued for about 5 more minutes or so, and then he begged me to turn on the lights because they were scared. I flicked on the small lamp at the foot of my bed, and just a few moments later, my friend started screaming and pointing to the ceiling. On the ceiling, covering pretty much the whole space, were what looked like dozens of shadowy hands and arms stretching out from above, reaching down towards us, but too far away to really grab anything. My friend was religious and started praying in a loud voice, over and over, and asking the hands to stop. They soon did, and for a moment, everything was fine again. It got warm, the hands were gone, and my friend and I both were starting to calm down. Then, it got much, much worse. Suddenly, the lamp turned on. Everything went to kind of dark to completely black and dead silent. A figure I can only describe as a tall, shadowy person, draped entirely in a black robe and carrying a large book, walks through the wall to my left, which was at most 5 feet from my feet. We could only see them because despite being all black, they were illuminated in a bright reddish-yellow glow. The figure stopped, turned, and stared at me for an uncomfortable amount of time, and eventually held up a long, not crazy long, but maybe like 6 inches, finger in my direction, and then pointed to their book, which then opened by itself. At this point, I let out the loudest scream I possibly could, hoping to wake my sisters, only to notice that there was no sound. I looked to my friend, who has their mouth open, looking like they're screaming as well, and still no sound. I looked to the window to see if maybe my parents are back, hoping they are, and the window is pitch black. Not even the outside light is shining through, or the usually spooky view of the graveyard I have. Just blackness. I look back to the figure, and it starts to move towards me, but I suddenly feel like there is no threat, and feel a kind and knowing feel, almost like you get from your grandparents or animals, and then it walks towards me and disappears just before it comes into contact with my feet. Immediately after they disappear, the light comes back on, the window is no longer black, and I can hear again. I hear my door banging and my dad screaming at me from the other side. He has been there for hours apparently, unable to get in, hearing me and my friend screaming at the top of our lungs from the other side. I get up and let him in, which I had no problems with from my side, and he lets me know what he just heard. He also lets me know that a couple hours apart, which to me didn't make sense because from what I judged by the time this went on, it was the latest 1 a.m. It was 7 a.m. The sun was actually just starting to come up, which I now noticed through the window. My friend called his parents to come get him immediately, and shortly after left. I sat up with my dad as everyone else went back to sleep, and we had a chat in the kitchen. Apparently this wasn't the first scary thing to happen in the house in the few weeks we had been there. My mother, who was a homemaker and at the house all the time, had been hearing moaning sounds during the day, seeing the appliances turn themselves on and off, and said that she kept being woken up by the sound of someone screaming in her ear in the middle of the night. My dad didn't believe it initially, but after I described him my encounter and the fact that he couldn't get in the room despite there being no lock on any door in our house, he started to. We moved out of that house less than a month later, which, to be honest, financially destroyed my family. We couldn't find a buyer because the locals thought the place to be very haunted, and we had to rent a small 2-bedroom bungalow. For the rest of my young life, that friend would never talk to me or hang out with me again, despite having been my best friend up to that point, I thought. Years later at a party, when I came home from university, I saw him at the campfire and started a chat. We went over what each had been up to, what our goals were, etc. Eventually I asked why he stopped hanging out with me. He told me he still vividly remembers that night, and then described it exactly how I remembered it, down to the smallest details. He said he told his father when he got home what happened, and his father, being the spiritual leader for his tribe, Native American, won't say reservation here, and his father told him to never come in contact with me, as there was a malicious spirit tied to my person that could start following him instead. Eventually, he stopped caring about that, and that's why he even talked to me at the party. End of Encounter 1. Let me know if you have any questions or have had anything similar happen. I genuinely feel like I encountered something really unique compared to most, and that is what scares me about this. I'm a moderately typical teenager from Japan, male. Ever since I can remember, I have throughout my lifetime had reoccurring encounters with some strange people, be it in terms of looks or behavior. These encounters can happen anywhere from a week's space to several months, and it always seems like when I do, it was their intention to meet me. My most recent one was on my way home from school. During my walk, I was looking down at my phone for a short moment, about to text one of my friends I plan to have over at my house later. As I look up, a young man looking like he was in his 20s was approaching me a few meters ahead. This confused me for a minute, as it was a straight and fairly long path ahead. I thought to myself that while I may have been looking at my phone, I would surely have noticed him coming from the corner of the path a good length away. Or at least, I expected him to be closer to that corner. But there he was, approaching from the middle as if he had appeared from thin air. His hair was a dark brown, a bit unkempt but still good-looking, and he had green eyes. His clothes were fairly ordinary too, keeping a sort of laid-back summer style to it. The most remarkable thing about him was his tattoo, or mark per se. A black line running from his left chin and down underneath his shirt. As he got close enough for conversation, he stopped me and asked for my name. When I told him, he said he'd heard about me before. This confused me, as I'm not exactly a celebrity, but I thought nothing more of it. We then had some boring small talk, but he genuinely seemed pretty cheerful. Just as he was about to take off, he told me that I should probably wait for my friend. He didn't give me much of a chance to respond to this before walking off in the direction he came from. I thought about what he said and turned around to walk back to school. I glanced behind my back not long after, only to find that he was nowhere to be seen. As I made it back to my school, I sure enough find my friend waiting by the gate. She apparently thought that we were going to walk to my place together and had been waiting for me for quite a long time. I apologized and we began walking. And well, that's kind of the end of it. I didn't tell her about the encounter, but I thought about it when she left. I didn't tell him or hint about my friend at all, so how would he have known? These types of encounters have kept on happening throughout my whole life, sometimes very frequently. And I don't know why. These people I meet just seem too unreal, and usually know something I never told them about, which leads me to believe these people aren't human at all. I might post more stories if anyone would be interested in them, but I'd like to know if someone might have some answers to who or what these people could be and why I keep encountering them. My 4-year-old son woke up screaming in distress. While my wife was comforting him, my 7-year-old daughter came out of her room and said that their bed was wet and it was scary. Backing up, last night we put our kids down for bed. They sleep in a bunk bed, my daughter on top. After my son was screaming and my daughter saying her bed was wet, I thought she had just sweat a lot and discounted the fact that it had scared her. I felt her, and she was completely dry. Dry hair, dry clothes, dry skin, not even clammy, dry underwear. I went into the room with her and felt her bed. It jolted me. Her sheets had a wet spot about 2 feet across, and her bed was soaked down to the mattress. I mean, soaked, like someone had poured an entire glass of water on her bed. She hadn't wet the bed. Like I said previously, she was completely dry, clothes and all. The position of the wet spot was odd as well. It was the upper half of the bed, from where her chin would have been to where her belly button would have been. Even odder, the bottom part of her pillow was soaked, and it cut off the top of the wet spot. By that, I mean it was like the liquid came from above, rather than getting the mattress wet and soaking into the pillow from below. The liquid was clear and scentless. I soaked as much of it up with towels as I could. There was enough liquid to even wring them out into a bowl, so I did exactly that. I have some water testing equipment for an aquarium I have downstairs, so I thought to test out the hardness and see if it was tap water. Our tap water was extremely hard and tests at 360 ppm. The liquid from her bed had registered at 555 ppm. It was 50% harder than the tap water and definitely not urine. The walls and ceiling in her room were bone dry. There was no other water bottles or cups in her room at all. The water basically came out of nowhere with no explanation, and there was a lot of it. I can't come up with anything to explain it, not one. And it has us both a little dumbfounded and freaked out. This is probably unrelated, but it adds to the creepiness. Our dog was completely freaked out last night, stress panting, not leaving my side, ears back, acting absolutely stressed, both before and for the duration of the evening. Anyone else ever experienced anything like this, or have any likely explanations?